The following story chronicles events reported in the deep forests of the Upper Peninsula, Michigan. While some names and locations have been altered for privacy, the core elements are derived from unsettling oral histories and regional folklore. Viewer caution is advised. They say the silence of the Michigan wilderness isn't empty. It's just waiting. It holds its breath the way a predator does before it strikes. And if you listen closely enough, past the whisper of the pines and the gentle, endless lapping of the Great Lakes, you can sometimes hear the grinding of old grudges, a sound that cuts deeper than any logger's axe. Mark Miller heard only opportunity when he first read the will, an opportunity neatly nestled between the probate papers and a brittle, century-old deed. An isolated, turn-of-the-century farmhouse in the Upper Peninsula, willed to him by a great-aunt he had only met once 50 years ago. It was an escape hatch from the sterile, crushing sameness of suburban life, a promise of a new, simpler beginning for his wife, Sarah, and their 10-year-old daughter, Lily. The journey itself was a descent into an older America. They drove until the asphalt surrendered to gravel, and the familiar convenience stores were replaced by roadside signs advertising bait, tackle, and homemade maple syrup. The air grew sharp, scented with balsam fir and wet earth, pulling the tension from Mark's shoulders but settling a strange, cold knot in Sarah's stomach. "Look, Lily," Sarah said, trying to inject enthusiasm into her voice. "Real fireflies. Not the ones stuck in the city haze." Lily, usually a chatterbox, pressed her face against the dusty window of their packed-to-the-gills SUV. She didn't respond to the fireflies. She was looking at the endless procession of trees, pines, maples, and towering, majestic white cedars. She felt less like she was moving to a new home and more like she was entering a vast, quiet cathedral built entirely of wood, and she was the only congregant. When they finally arrived, the house, known locally as the Hemlock Place, stood like a forgotten sentinel at the edge of the forest. It wasn't picturesque. It was tall, narrow, and weathered to a deep, stoic gray. The veranda sagged slightly, and the windows, though intact, held a perpetually dusty glaze that made them look like blind eyes. A thick, oppressive quiet surrounded it, a profound silence that seemed to absorb all other sounds. Mark, the eternal optimist, clapped his hands together. "Well, here it is, girls. A blank slate, a fresh start." Sarah stepped onto the porch, the floorboards groaning a deep, resonant welcome beneath her weight. She scanned the horizon. The yard was overgrown, a tangle of goldenrod and wild raspberry bushes, but beyond it, the forest rose like a solid, black wall. It was the density, the sheer thickness of the woods, that gave her pause. She was used to woods you could see through. This forest was a barrier. Lily, however, was drawn not to the house but to the overgrown patch behind an old, crumbling stone well. She walked slowly, her small sneakers crunching the damp pine needles, until she reached a small, exposed root system. There, half buried in the soil, she found it. A toy. It was roughly carved from a piece of dark, hard wood, shaped like a miniature lumberjack. It was old, polished smooth by time and handling, and though the details were faded, Lily could clearly see the tiny, sharp axe it carried, carved into the wood itself. She picked it up. It felt strangely warm, like a stone that had baked in the sun all day, even though the air was cool. The following morning, Mark made the trip into the nearest town, Eagle River, for supplies. The town was a charming, slightly faded postcard, centered around a single stoplight and a general store that smelled perpetually of coffee and aged spices. He bought paint, tools, and a local history book. As he was loading the truck, an ancient man sitting on a bench outside the store, a man with a face like crumpled leather and eyes the color of lake ice, spoke without turning his head. This was Old Man Hemlock, the last descendant of the family who built the Miller's house. "You're the Miller boy, ain't ya?" the old man rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "That's right. Mark Miller. Just inherited the old Hemlock place. I just remember this," the old man continued, now finally fixing Mark with an unnerving stare. "The wood remembers. It holds. And that land back toward the river, that ain't just forest. That's felled ground. You leave it alone. You hear? Leave the ground alone. What was taken there, it ain't done taking." Mark, pragmatic and suburban, chuckled nervously. "Sounds like an old logger's tale, sir." The old man didn't laugh. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the gravel and turned back to staring at nothing. "Call it what you will, boy, but you look close at the porch. Count the steps. Tell me how many are rotten. That's how many days you got before the ground starts looking for what's owed." Back at the Hemlock place, Sarah was having her own unsettling experience. She was trying to clean out the fireplace when Lily wandered in, hugging the wooden lumberjack toy close. "Mom, do we have any blankets for Silas?" Lily asked, her voice soft and innocent. "Silas? Who's Silas, sweetie?" Sarah asked, kneeling down. "The man who made the house. He doesn't like the cold. He says his friends left him to freeze." Lily pointed to a dark corner near the chimney. "He's standing right there. He says the house is his, but we can borrow it if we're careful with the wood." A chill, far colder than the Michigan autumn air, crept down Sarah's spine. She couldn't see anyone, but the corner Lily pointed to was noticeably colder than the rest of the room. A single bead of sweat, despite the sudden chill, traced a path down her neck. She forced a smile. "That's a sweet thought, honey. But maybe Silas should stay outside and let us unpack. We'll be very careful with the house, I promise." Just then, from deep within the forest, a sound started. It was faint at first, easily dismissed as a branch snapping. But it quickly gained a steady, inhuman rhythm. Chop, chop, chop. It was the unmistakable, powerful sound of an axe driving deep into solid wood. Yet it was midnight quiet and far too late for any legal logging operation. It sounded close, too close, despite the impenetrable wall of pines. Mark arrived home an hour later, still preoccupied with Old Man Hemlock's cryptic warnings. He was relieved to find Sarah and Lily safe, though pale. He immediately checked the sound. He walked out onto the back porch, straining his ears, but the only sound was the chirp of a cricket and the low, steady rush of wind through the tall trees. The phantom chopping had ceased entirely. "I heard it too, Mark," Sarah whispered, her hand clutching his arm tightly. "It was so clear. Right there." Mark tried to reassure her with logic. "Must be a local just cutting wood late, or maybe just the house settling. It's an old place, Sarah, full of natural noises." But he couldn't deny the profound, unnatural silence that swallowed all sound, making the previous chopping seem like a sudden, jarring intrusion in a world that hated noise. Later, lying in bed, Mark thought about the old man's peculiar instruction. Count the steps. He slipped out of bed in the dark and went down the hall, pulling on his boots. Using the light from his phone, he walked to the front porch and knelt. He ran his hand over the aged timber. The first 3 were sturdy. The 4th creaked only slightly. The 5th, however, was soft and spongy, definitely rotten. He counted them again, meticulously, pressing his thumb against the decaying wood. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 rotten steps. He stood up, staring into the black, unyielding wall of the Michigan forest, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air sinking into his bones. 5 days. 5 days until the land starts looking for what's owed. The Millers had come to the Hemlock place seeking peace and a new beginning, armed only with optimism and a desire for change. They quickly learned that some history cannot be repainted or ignored, especially when it is rooted deep in the soil and the wood itself. The first lesson of the wild is caution and respect. Do not dismiss the warnings of the elders and the history of the land you inhabit, for some boundaries are not marked by fences but by old pain and powerful grief. Mark drove a long nail into the soft, rotten wood of the fifth step, a desperate, symbolic attempt to fix what felt impossibly broken. Mark and Sarah were convinced the mysterious chopping was a warning. But was it a warning to leave, or a promise of payment to be exacted? And what of Silas, the invisible friend their daughter Lily was now keeping? A lonely spirit seeking comfort, or the first eager claim of the felled ground? We are only on the porch, but the quiet house is beginning to stir. In the deep woods of the Upper Peninsula, the trees don't just grow. They wait, and sometimes they listen. Once a secret is buried here, the forest becomes its grave marker, silent and unyielding. But if you begin to dig, if you break the seal of that silence, the land will start to whisper its secrets back to you. And often those secrets are sharp. Mark woke on the first full morning in the Hemlock Place to a sensation that was fundamentally wrong. The feeling of being watched. He opened his eyes, certain he would see a massive buck or perhaps an early morning hunter peering in. But the window showed only the dark, tangled edge of the forest, silent and motionless. Yet, the feeling persisted, a cold, steady pressure on his back, like the scrutiny of 1,000 unseen eyes. He remembered the 5 rotten steps and the 4 days he now had left. The rational part of his brain, the part that balanced spreadsheets and paid mortgages, labeled it superstition, the byproduct of isolation and the old man's deliberate theatrics. But the nail he'd driven into the rotten wood the night before was tangible, a physical act against an abstract dread. The day was dedicated to unpacking, a futile attempt to impose order on a house that seemed determined to reject it. Sarah, usually energetic, moved through the rooms with a heavy, leaden tread. Her anxiety had solidified overnight, moving past general unease into a targeted fear of the woods and the house's history. She kept the curtains drawn, claiming the morning sun was too harsh, but truly to block the suffocating view of the dense pines. Lily, on the other hand, was quieter, almost unnaturally placid. Her usual whirlwind energy was gone, replaced by long stretches of silence where she would sit in the drafty living room, running her small thumb over the smooth wood of her lumberjack toy. She hadn't mentioned Silas again, but Mark and Sarah would occasionally catch her tilting her head, listening to something they couldn't hear, before nodding slowly to herself. That afternoon, while Sarah tried to find where the persistent scent of damp earth was coming from in the kitchen, Mark decided to face the paperwork. He needed to find the source of Old Man Hemlock's warning. He spread the large, crinkly deed across the dining table, its parchment yellowed and brittle. The original documents were dense with archaic legal terminology and flowery handwriting. Mark skimmed through the boundaries, property lines, and easements until a specific, handwritten clause jumped out at him, tucked away on the 3rd page. It described the back acreage abutting the old river basin. The owner shall hold no claim upon any timber felled within the boundaries of the felled ground, nor shall any new structure be raised upon this specific acreage, for the wood belongs to the land and the spirit that holds its claim unto perpetuity. The words were almost poetic, terrifyingly anachronistic for a legal document. The spirit that holds its claim. It confirmed the old man's story wasn't just folklore. It was woven into the very legal history of the Hemlock Place. Mark felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The felled ground was real, and it was tied to a binding agreement written over a century ago. Meanwhile, a different kind of disturbance was beginning outside. It started as an intermittent tapping, a dry, brittle sound, like a fingernail gently clicking against glass. It was irregular and low, easily mistaken for a pine cone falling onto the roof or an icicle dripping off the eaves. Sarah heard it first in the kitchen, right at the window above the sink. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. She ignored it, focusing on scrubbing mold from the ancient cupboards. But when she walked into the living room, the sound followed her. Tap, tap. This time, it was coming from the narrow window on the eastern wall. Mark, deep in the deed, heard it too. He dismissed it as a bird at first, but the rhythm was wrong, too deliberate for nature. It was like something was trying to gain attention, to get inside without being too loud. "Lily, honey, can you move away from the wall?" Sarah asked softly, seeing her daughter sitting near the tapping sound, her head bowed over the wooden toy. Lily looked up, her expression confused. "It's Silas. He's telling me about the wood. He says he built something beautiful here, but his friends smashed it." She stood up, walking toward the window. "He says the tapping is just him knocking the splinters out of his knuckles. They really hurt." As Lily got closer to the window, the tapping ceased. In its place, the sound from the previous night returned, but louder, richer, and closer. Chop, chop, chop. It was no longer a distant phantom noise. It sounded like someone was working right at the edge of the property line, just beyond the dense barrier of the oldest trees. Mark rushed to the back door and flung it open, letting the cold, pine-scented air rush in. He peered out, his heart hammering against his ribs. The forest was absolutely still. No lights, no movement, no smoke, and most terrifyingly, the sound stopped the instant the door opened. The sudden silence was immediate and complete, as if the sound had been a physical object instantly retracted into the shadows. "It's right there," Sarah whispered from behind him, her voice trembling. "It sounds like it's 10 feet away." "What is it, Mark?" Mark looked at the dense, dark woods, and then at the faint, oppressive cold that seemed to radiate from the ground near where the sound originated. He glanced back at his daughter, who was staring out into the darkness with a strange, passive acceptance, still clutching the little carved lumberjack. Mark realized the sound wasn't random. It was a rhythmic reminder, a chilling announcement of continued, unending labor. The Millers closed the door, sealing themselves back inside the decaying house. They agreed they needed to research the history of the Hemlock family and the logging operations in the specific area. The rational explanation was now completely out of reach. The sound ceased when approached. It moved with deliberate intent, and it was inextricably linked to their daughter's new, unsettling friend, Silas. Mark sat Sarah down and showed her the clause in the deed regarding the felled ground and the spirit's claim. This shared, tangible piece of evidence provided a strange, terrifying sense of validation. They weren't going crazy. They were dealing with history and a legally recognized curse. They realized the steps were not just counting down to something happening, but to an event tied to the land's vengeful history. The curse, the tapping, the phantom chopping. They all seemed designed to break their will and turn their curiosity into fear. As the first full night settled over the Hemlock place, heavy and silent once more, Mark and Sarah tucked a quiet Lily into bed. They had sought out the wilderness for peace, but the wilderness had offered them a fight against the unseen, driven by a ghost's ancient claim. They learned that unchecked curiosity is a dangerous thing. Not all mysteries are meant to be solved, and some secrets of the land are meant to be left untouched and alone. When the earth holds a grudge, digging up the past only gives the ghost fresh air to breathe. Mark knew the only way to understand what was happening was to find out who Silas Thorne was and what tragedy occurred on that specific, forbidden acreage. He had to know the root of the vengeance. But the tapping, that gentle, persistent knock, was now moving inside the house itself, a faint scraping sound coming from the walls near Lily's room. What happens when the spirit moves from tapping on the boundaries to clawing at the very structure of the house they call home? Every old house is a reliquary, holding not just furniture and dust, but the weight of every emotional storm that broke within its walls. In the Hemlock Place, the storm wasn't just old. It was patient. It had been gathering strength for over a century, waiting for a new family to move in, a new audience for an ancient tragedy. The Millers now understood they weren't just homeowners. They were inheriting a debt owed to a vengeful, solitary spirit. The morning after finding the curse written into the deed, the Millers moved with strained, deliberate silence. The knowledge of the felled ground and Lily's familiarity with Silas had shifted their dread from general anxiety to focused terror. The house felt less like a potential home and more like the inside of a drum, waiting for the next, inevitable beat of the axe. They knew they had only 4 days left, based on the rotten steps, to understand the threat before it grew fully manifest. They decided to split their focus. Mark, protective and pragmatic, would stay close to Lily, attempting to find any hidden mechanism, any rational, albeit unlikely, explanation for the sounds near the house. Sarah, intuitive and historical, would go into the town of Eagle River and delve into the archives to find out who Silas Thorne was. The trip to the library was a relief for Sarah, a chance to step away from the oppressive, pine-scented silence of the Hemlock Place. The Eagle River Public Library was a small, brick building with a quiet, elderly archivist who seemed as much a fixture as the dusty card catalogs. Sarah, fabricating a story about researching local architecture, asked to view any documents pertaining to the original Hemlock family logging company from the late 1800s. Meanwhile, back at the farmhouse, Mark was walking the perimeter, feeling utterly exposed. He was trying to track any path that might lead to the felled ground, but the forest was too dense, the undergrowth too tangled. He kept one ear open for Lily, who was playing quietly in the living room, building a small, elaborate log cabin out of mismatched wooden blocks. The wooden lumberjack toy was, of course, the central figure in her structure. Sarah spent hours poring over microfilm and brittle newspaper clippings. She finally found it. A small, faded article from the winter of 1898, titled, "Tragedy at Hemlock Creek. Logging crew lost in early blizzard." The article detailed a devastating, sudden snowstorm that trapped a logging crew, led by a man named Elias Hemlock, deep in the woods. The piece focused mainly on Elias, but Sarah found a sidebar referencing a missing foreman, a gifted woodcarver named Silas Thorne. The critical detail came from an account by the only survivor, a young boy. He confessed that Elias Hemlock, prioritizing the newly cut timber over the lives of his crew, had pulled their only working sled out, promising to return with aid, but intentionally abandoned them to save the valuable harvest. An even older, handwritten journal she found next to the microfilm cassette confirmed the rest. It was written by the local parson, detailing the subsequent discovery of the bodies. Silas Thorne's corpse was found near the cursed acreage, frozen, but with one hand grasping a blood-stained piece of paper. On it, carved with a splintered nail, was a simple, chilling vow. "The wood is yours, Elias, but the land is mine, and I will claim a life for every tree you stole from the felled ground. The timber will be claimed, one way or another." Silas had cursed the land and his betrayers, binding his vengeance not just to the family, but to the physical environment, the wood itself. Sarah felt a profound wave of understanding and terror. Her daughter's friend wasn't imaginary. He was the ghost of a righteous, betrayed man whose anger was anchored by a century-old curse. At the Hemlock Place, Mark was working on securing a loose shutter when he instinctively looked up toward the deep wood line. It was a fleeting moment, a shift in the quality of the shadows. For a split second, He saw something impossibly large, too large to be an animal, standing between the trunks of two massive pines. It was a dense, towering silhouette, thicker than any man, draped in what looked like shaggy, splintered wood and shadow. It didn't move like a person. It simply occupied space in a way that defied physics, a massive, oppressive column of darkness. Mark blinked, and it was gone, swallowed instantly by the uniform density of the forest. But the image was burned into his mind. A figure of wood and malice, the embodiment of the vengeful timber shade Old Man Hemlock had hinted at. When he went back inside, trying to steady his trembling hands, he noticed something in Lily's block cabin. The miniature, carved lumberjack toy was no longer sitting upright. It had been moved so that the small, carved axe head was laid flat, pointing directly through the living room window, straight toward the ominous darkness of the felled ground. This was not Lily's doing. She was still upstairs, preoccupied with a coloring book. The spirit was not only watching, it was arranging their artifacts, communicating its desires. When Sarah returned, the car loaded with old texts and microfiche printouts, she found a terrified Mark staring out the back window. They quickly put their pieces together. The deed, the steps, the newspaper, the massive silhouette, and the terrifyingly purposeful movement of the wooden toy. They now knew the full story of Silas Thorne, a betrayed man, cursed to protect his claim on the felled ground timber, demanding vengeance. The curse was karma for the betrayal and greed of Elias Hemlock. They were trapped between a curse of betrayal and the vengeful shade of the woods. The presence was escalating from phantom sounds to visual manifestation, and worse, it was using their daughter to communicate. The weight of the house felt heavier now, not just with dust, but with sin. The Millers had learned a critical lesson about honesty and betrayal. The price paid when greed causes one man to abandon others is not only measured in immediate human life, but in the lingering, powerful poison of a vengeful spirit that binds itself to the land. Some wounds are so deep, they scar the very earth itself, and those scars demand payment. They knew the who and the why, but they didn't know the how of the curse. Specifically, how to break it or what, precisely, the timber shade intended to take from their family as payment for Elias Hemlock's crime. The wooden toy, the miniature axe, still pointed to the woods. Was it a demand for the Millers to give up their wood, their house, or something far more precious? Fear is a boundary designed to keep danger out. But what happens when the danger learns to manipulate the boundaries of the mind? A vengeful spirit, tethered to the cold earth, will always seek warmth. And in the lonely, wooden architecture of the Hemlock place, it found the easiest, most vulnerable source of light and life: a child. The timber shade had finished knocking on the door. Now it was carving a path through the window of Lily's soul. The terror for Mark and Sarah was no longer the threat of the woods outside, but the chilling realization that the threat was already inside. Silas Thorne, the betrayed carver, was not content with merely lurking. He was actively, psychologically manipulating their daughter. The immediate priority, fueled by desperate parental instinct, was to sever the connection between Lily and the cursed artifact. Before breakfast, while Lily was watching cartoons, Sarah found the small, carved wooden lumberjack, which Mark had hidden deep within a locked, metal toolbox in the basement. She took it, wrapped it tightly in 3 layers of thick cloth, and placed it on the highest shelf of the master bedroom closet, burying it under a pile of heavy winter coats. She felt a profound sense of relief, certain she had neutralized the immediate catalyst for the spirit's influence. The day began tense, defined by Mark and Sarah constantly monitoring Lily, trying to engage her in normal activities, like decorating a pumpkin or reading a story, anything to distract her from her invisible companion. Lily remained withdrawn but cheerful, humming little tunes she had never sung before. She seemed oddly unaffected by the oppressive atmosphere, perhaps shielded, or perhaps entirely consumed by it. That evening, as Sarah went to retrieve laundry from the master bedroom, her heart plummeted. There, lying perfectly centered on the pristine white duvet, was the unwrapped, wooden lumberjack toy. It was facing the door, its smooth, dark wood catching the faint light from the hall. The coats Sarah had piled on top of it were undisturbed, the closet door still shut. The toy had not just been moved. It had materialized, passing through physical barriers with a terrifying, purposeful ease. The full escalation of Silas's manipulation began at dinner. Lily picked at her food, then looked up at her parents with a serious, grown-up expression that seemed entirely alien on her 10-year-old face. "Silas says he's happy," she announced, her voice unervingly calm. "He says he's doing a very good job. The house is warm now, isn't it?" Mark and Sarah glanced at each other. The house, in fact, felt colder than ever. A perpetual, damp draft seemed to cling to the inner walls, a sensation that transcended the actual temperature. "What exactly is Silas doing, sweetie?" Mark asked, keeping his voice gentle, despite the panic rising in his throat. "He's fixing the walls," Lily replied simply. "He said the old man who owned the house before, Hemlock, he cheated him. He stole the wood that was meant to be his. So Silas is taking it back, piece by piece. He says he needs a favor to finish the job." Sarah felt a rush of protective horror. "What kind of favor, Lily? What does he want?" Lily shrugged, pulling a crayon from her pocket and flipping over a placemat. "I don't know yet, but he showed me what he looks like when he's working." She quickly sketched a picture. It wasn't the sad, frozen man Sarah had read about. It was a terrifying distortion. A figure of massive height and shadow, draped in splinters and pine needles, just as Mark had seen in the fleeting glimpse. But the eyes Lily had drawn too small, intense circles of red crayon, blazing like embers deep within the shadowy face. The glowing red eyes of the timber shade. Mark tried to take the crayon from her, but at that exact moment, the house groaned. It wasn't the usual settling noise of an old structure. It was a guttural, sickening sound, a deep, resonant scrap that vibrated through their plates and rattled the glassware. It sounded exactly like an impossibly large knife being dragged slowly and forcefully across solid, dry wood. The noise came from the second-floor wall, right next to Lily's bedroom. It was prolonged and agonizing, the sound of the house itself being violently violated. Mark bolted upstairs, Sarah clinging to his arm, the scent of fresh, damp pines suddenly overwhelming them. They found no physical damage, no cracks, no splinters, no visible source for the noise. Yet the cold spot in the hallway was now immense, and when Mark placed his ear against the wall of Lily's room, he heard a terrifying, faint whirring sound, like a massive, unseen tool endlessly working within the plaster and lath. They realized the full, terrifying scope of Silas Thorne's curse. He was the master carver, betrayed for the wood he loved. Now, he wasn't just haunting the land. He was reclaiming the stolen wood that built the Hemlock place, meticulously dismantling it from the inside out. The scraping was his work, and the house was his canvas of vengeance. They brought Lily downstairs, wrapping her tightly in a blanket. Mark took the wooden toy, which had been left forgotten on the table after Lily finished her drawing, and violently threw it into the roaring fire in the hearth. But the fire, instead of consuming the dark wood, instantly hissed, the flames shrinking away as if physically repelled. The toy just sat there, blackening but refusing to burn. A final, gentle tap came from the wall, followed by Lily's small, calm voice. "Silas says you can't burn his work, and he'll keep working until he gets the favor." Mark and Sarah pulled their daughter close, realizing the battle had shifted entirely. This wasn't about property anymore. It was about possession. The lesson they learned was the critical necessity of parental vigilance. A parent's duty is to protect the innocent from all harm, seen and unseen. The spiritual enemy will always target the most vulnerable, and the strongest protection against an ancient, cold spirit is the immediate, unwavering warmth of family love. The scraped walls of the Hemlock place marked the next stage of the attack. Silas Thorne was physically breaching their home, demanding payment. They had only 3 days left according to the rotten steps. What was the favor the timber shade needed to stop his terrifying internal demolition? And how long could the house and their daughter withstand the sound of a vengeful ghost carving away at its very core? When a family is under siege, the greatest danger often shifts from the external enemy to the internal erosion of trust. The timber shade had found its path into the Hemlock place, not just through the wood, but through the mind of a child. Now, as the house groaned under the ghost's relentless, scraping work, Mark and Sarah faced a terrible choice. Stay within the weakening walls and wait for the spirit's favor, or venture into the forbidden, haunted acreage where the curse was born. Sometimes, the only way to stop a thing is to meet it on its own ground. The scraping had not stopped. It was not constant, but it was relentless. A slow, tearing, guttural noise that started and stopped seemingly at will, moving along the inner structure of the house like a massive, unseen rodent chewing through bone. It was a sound designed to erode sanity, a physical manifestation of Silas Thorne's destructive rage. They were down to 2 days. The house was being carved apart. Mark and Sarah spent a sleepless night, listening to the agonizing noises, clutching Lily between them. By dawn, they realized they couldn't wait for Silas to articulate his demand. They had to understand the felled ground completely. If Silas's power was tied to the land he died defending, then the solution must lie there too. They had to breach the most dangerous boundary. They prepared for the journey with the gravity of preparing for war. They packed a flashlight, a compass, and a small, sturdy spade for digging. They instructed Lily, who seemed disturbingly comfortable with the situation, that she was to stay indoors. Under no circumstances was she to open the door, and she was to ignore Silas until they returned. "He's making a mess," Lily observed simply, pointing vaguely toward a wall where a faint smell of pine pitch now lingered. "He says he needs a big payment soon." Leaving her alone was the hardest thing Mark and Sarah had ever done. The guilt of abandoning their daughter to the presence of the timber shade was a heavy weight, but they knew that venturing into the felled ground together was the only chance for an answer. They stepped off the back porch and into the dense Michigan forest, the silence immediately closing over them, thick and cold like heavy velvet. The woods near the house were a battle against nature. The undergrowth was a thorny, tangled mess, and the fallen pines lay across their path like giant, skeletal barricades. It was clear this section of the forest actively resisted passage. They followed the compass, pushing toward the rough location of the river basin referenced in the deed. As they walked deeper, the trees began to change. The stately, straight pines and cedars gave way to gnarled, sickly-looking trunks. Branches twisted down toward the earth, looking like tormented arms. The air grew perceptibly colder, and the rich forest scent of decaying leaves vanished, replaced by a strange, metallic smell, like old rust and dry dust. Then they found it. The felled ground was not a massive clearing. It was a bizarrely perfect circle, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, where nothing at all grew. The earth was hard, compacted clay, completely barren. No weeds, no moss, no insects, and not a single fallen leaf rested on its surface. It was a wound in the living body of the forest. The tormented, twisted trees surrounding the circle were so thick and close they appeared to be forming a deliberate, defensive wall against the space. Mark stepped onto the barren clay. The cold intensified, radiating up through the soles of his boots. It was an unnatural cold, sterile and profound, as if the ground itself had died 100 years ago. "This is it," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with awe and fear. "This is where he died, where hemlock left them." They began to search the barren ground. They didn't have to look long. In the exact center of the circle, where the clay was darkest, Mark's boot scuffed against something hard and uneven. He knelt down and began to dig with the small spade, and within minutes, he unearthed a relic of the past. A massive, rusted, incredibly thick logging chain, still partially wrapped around a shattered piece of rotten wood. It was the chain used to haul the ill-fated timber, the chain of betrayal. The emotional strain, combined with the profound cold and the terrifying sight of the chain, finally broke the fragile truce between them. "This is ridiculous," Sarah cried, the words bursting out, shrill with terror. "We're digging up old chains in a ghost graveyard. We should have sold the house the day we saw those ridiculous deeds. Why did you insist on a fresh start in a cursed place?" "Because it was family property, Sarah," Mark shot back, fear transforming into sudden, bitter anger. "Because I was trying to save us. If you hadn't been so negative about everything from the start, maybe we wouldn't have focused so much on the stupid steps." The argument was ugly, fueled by exhaustion and the desperate need to blame the rising panic on anything but the vengeful spirit watching them. It was a perfect emotional storm, and in the profound, watching silence of the felled ground, they felt the atmosphere tighten, as if the space itself was greedily drinking in their fear and discord. Shaken, they pulled back, suddenly ashamed. The atmosphere around them seemed to momentarily settle, the unnatural cold perhaps softening slightly. They realized that their fear was now an active tool for Silas. The spirit, fueled by betrayal, was attempting to break them apart, mirroring the greed and lack of unity that had caused his death. Mark reached out, his hand finding Sarah's. His fear remained, but his anger vanished. "I'm sorry, Sarah. We are in this together. We have to be." They confirmed what they knew. The felled ground was the source of Silas's power, his grave, and the chain was the physical manifestation of the betrayal. They had touched the root of the curse, but they still didn't know the favor Silas demanded, only that he was dismantling their home to force the issue. They turned to leave the silent, barren circle, the rusted chain lying exposed and cold in the dirt. Walking out of the felled ground, their boots crunching on the treacherous, tangled undergrowth, they understood the importance of unity and communication. When facing an overwhelming threat, trust and cohesion are the most powerful shields. The curse of the timber shade was born from betrayal, and their greatest defense was the unwavering honesty and love that Silas himself had been denied. They had to face the spirit as one. They had identified the center of the curse, but they had left the cursed chain lying in the barren clay. As they emerged from the treeline, exhausted and emotionally drained, they noticed the faint, distant scent of wood smoke on the wind, a smell that shouldn't be there, since they had no fire burning. Had the felled ground marked them? And was that smell a sign of Silas's continued work, or a premonition of the final, terrible payment he was about to exact from the wood and from their family? The felled ground was where the curse took root, but the hemlock place was where the curse was coming to fruition. The timber shade, fueled by a century of cold vengeance, was no longer just making noise. It was taking the house apart piece by piece, claiming the stolen timber. When a spirit is tethered to wood and betrayal, its ultimate form of attack is both environmental and deeply, personally traumatic. And sometimes, the only way to truly understand a curse is to live the tragedy that created it. The moment they stepped back onto the porch, leaving the cold, barren felled ground behind, the silence of the woods felt momentarily less threatening. The greater danger was now behind the door. They had found unity, but the house itself was failing. The scent of pine and damp earth that followed them inside was heavy, and the lights, Mark noticed immediately, were dimmer, struggling against an invisible, draining presence. The relentless, internal scraping had stopped, but a deeper, mechanical strain had replaced it. The electricity, which should have been their modern shield against the dark past, flickered violently. Exhausted from the confrontation, the hike, and the emotional toll of their argument, Mark and Sarah tried to establish a sense of normalcy for Lily, who was now quietly drawing pictures that featured the massive, twisting trees they had just seen. Mark checked the circuit breaker, finding nothing wrong. The power failure wasn't electrical. It felt environmental, as if something large was sucking the energy and warmth out of the very structure of the home. They decided they needed rest to process the information they had gained. They put Lily down for an early night, placing her wooden toy, which they still could not destroy, on her dresser, unable to bring themselves to touch it again after its reemergence. Sarah fell into a fitful, shallow sleep. She didn't have a normal dream. She had a vision. It was intensely vivid, brutally cold, and utterly terrifying. She was no longer Sarah Miller. She was Silas Thorne. She felt the paralyzing, bone-deep ache of the 1898 blizzard, the ice forming instantly on her beard and eyelashes. She saw the snow-covered faces of the men she was responsible for, their desperation turning to quiet acceptance of death. Then, the sound of the approaching sled, the hope that flared, and the blinding, agonizing horror as Elias Hemlock looked her, Silas, right in the eye, and spurred the horses away, prioritizing the stacks of freshly cut timber over their lives. She felt the final, total betrayal, the loss of her men, the loss of her life, and the desecration of the natural land she had sworn to protect as a carver. As the cold claimed her, she felt a powerful, non-human rage rise up, binding itself not to heaven or hell, but to the cold, hard wood of the earth. She saw her hand, frozen stiff, splinter a branch and carve the fateful, chilling curse into the frozen clay of the felled ground. The vow of vengeance was not just words. It was a final, agonizing prayer of malice. Sarah woke with a gasp, sweat covering her body despite the room's profound chill. She understood Silas Thorne not as a monster, but as a man consumed by the ultimate betrayal. His rage was absolute, and he sought not just death, but justice rooted in the timber that was stolen. Just as she sat up, Lily screamed. A short, sharp burst of terror. Mark and Sarah rushed into Lily's room. Lily was sitting up in bed, crying, pointing to the dresser. The lights in the house, already dim, pulsed rapidly, casting dancing, erratic shadows on the walls. The wooden lumberjack toy was no longer a rough carving. The spirit had finished its work. The dark wooden body was splintered and cracked down the middle. The smooth handle it once had was completely gone, splintered into tiny fragments scattered on the dresser top. Protruding from the splintered wood where the figure's hand should have been was a perfect, razor-sharp, miniature metal axe head. It gleamed dully in the chaotic light, small enough to be held in a child's hand, yet terrifyingly real and deadly. The toy was now a weapon, a sign of the spirit's violent intent. The vision gave Sarah the key. Silas's hatred was focused on the act of taking. His vengeance demanded that the stolen timber be reclaimed, and the miniature axe head was the tool he would use, or force them to use, to carry out the final, painful act of his curse. The favor was becoming horribly clear. Silas wanted a life, as payment for the lives and timber Elias stole, and the axe was the instrument. Mark carefully picked up the dangerous artifact, instantly feeling the profound, unnatural cold radiating from the metal blade. They were certain now they had only one day left. The 5 rotten steps were down to 1. The house was failing, and the spirit had armed itself. As dawn broke, painting the eastern Michigan sky in hues of cold blue and pale orange, Mark and Sarah held the lethal artifact. They knew that running was futile. The curse was bound to the family and the land. They had learned that facing fear means more than standing up to a ghost. It means confronting the painful, historical truth behind the monster. The only way to break a cycle of vengeance is often by understanding and addressing the emotional root of the original conflict, even if it is a century old. They knew the tool and they knew the source of the pain. But how does one bargain with a betrayed, carving spirit who seeks justice for wood and life? With the house actively dying around them, and the metal axe cold and heavy in Mark's hand, they needed more than courage. They needed a counter-ritual. They needed to find a way to honor Silas's vow without meeting his murderous demand. But where, in the modern world, could they find the answers to an archaic logger's curse? Terror often drives us toward isolation, but sometimes survival lies in seeking the voices we once dismissed. The Millers had faced the silence of the forest and the sound of the ghost's vengeance. They held the miniature axe, a razor-sharp symbol of betrayal. With only the final rotten steps separating them from the curse's full manifestation, they knew they needed more than courage. They needed ancient knowledge, the forgotten lore of the deep Michigan woods, held only by those who still listened to the whispers of the pines. The morning was cold, despite the sun. Mark stared at the single, final rotten step on the porch, the last sliver of time remaining before the countdown ended. The house groaned above him, not a settling sound, but the sound of wood fibers straining, as if under immense, slow pressure. The miniature metal axe, wrapped tightly in a canvas rag, felt impossibly heavy in his coat pocket. They knew Silas Thorne was a vengeful ghost, a shade of wood and fury, but they didn't know how to fight a spirit whose power was tied to the very material of their home. Mark and Sarah made a desperate decision. They had to find Old Man Hemlock, the only local who had acknowledged the truth of the curse. They left Lily, still unnerved but safe, with the sternest warning possible, to stay in the center room, away from the walls, and not to speak to the air. They drove back to Eagle River, the tense 20-minute drive filled with a heavy, unspoken dread. They found Old Man Hemlock where Mark had first seen him, sitting on a bench outside the general store, carving a simple, unhurried block of pine. Mark approached him, pulling the canvas-wrapped axe head from his pocket and placing it on the bench beside the old man. "We took your warning as superstition, Mr. Hemlock," Mark said, his voice raw with exhaustion and fear. "We found the felled ground. We know about Silas Thorne and the curse, but we don't know how to stop it. He's taking our house apart, and he's trying to use our daughter." Old Man Hemlock stopped carving. He didn't flinch at the sight of the dark, cursed wood and the gleaming metal axe head. He simply pressed his thumb against the sharp blade, his face impassive. I knew you'd be back," the old man rasped. "The Hemlock bloodline always comes back to the wood. You're trying to burn it, ain't ya? Trying to run from it. That won't work. Silas Thorne wasn't just a man. He was a master carver, a priest of the forest, if you believe the old ways. He didn't just love wood. He believed the spirits of the trees lived in the wood he cut. When your ancestor betrayed him, he bound his very soul to the earth and the timber." Hemlock leaned in conspiratorially, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The timber shade feeds on 2 things, stolen wood and human fear. He's taking your house because it was built from the stolen harvest. And he's turning your daughter against you because he wants the ultimate payment, a life to be taken by the axe of betrayal." Sarah gripped Mark's arm. So what do? We can't give him a life. No, Hemlock agreed, his eyes sharp. You can't. But the curse can be honored, not broken. Silas didn't just want blood. He wanted justice for the wood. You need a true offering of life and respect to silence a vengeful carver. He explained that Silas Thorne's curse had a loophole, a ritual of reconciliation known only to the original families. They had to perform the ritual of sap and smoke. First, they had to find the witness tree, an ancient, massive maple or cedar that stood near the felled ground and had witnessed Elias Hemlock's betrayal. They must gently pierce it and collect its sap, the very blood and life force of the forest. This sap was the offering. Second, they must take the cursed miniature axe and burn it on the barren ground of the felled ground in a purifying fire, not to destroy Silas, but to release the vengeance bound to the wood. You offer the true life of the forest, the sap, and you burn the instrument of his vengeance on the very spot he died. It's the only way to release the curse from the house and your child. Hemlock concluded, returning to his carving with a finality that brooked no further argument. But you must do it before the final night. If the shade finishes his carving, the price will be paid in full. Mark and Sarah thanked the old man, their fear now tempered by focus. They had a mission, a tangible countermeasure against the curse. The miniature axe, once a symbol of their impending doom, was now the key to their salvation. The danger was immense. The felled ground, the immense size of the witness tree, and the rapid descent toward nightfall. But they finally held the knowledge necessary to fight back. They drove back, passing the invisible clock of the final rotten step, knowing the timber shade was waiting for them to return to his domain. Speeding toward the Hemlock place, the Millers realized the core moral of Silas Thorne's tale was one of respect for nature. The curse wasn't just personal vengeance. It was the earth fighting back against human greed and imbalance. The consequence of taking from the earth without respect or balance can linger for generations. And the only path to peace is to honor the natural world and acknowledge its inherent spiritual power. They knew the ritual, but the forest was vast and dark, and the witness tree was hidden. The final day was quickly fading into twilight, and the timber shade was closing in on his final payment. How would they locate an ancient, specific tree in the dangerous felled ground before the final, terrifying night fell, and what would happen when they tried to burn the axe? The ultimate confrontation was now inevitable. The final hour of the curse had arrived. When knowledge replaces panic, fear gives way to a desperate, focused resolve. The timber shade knew the Millers held the key to his peace, and that knowledge enraged him. The moment Mark and Sarah returned to the Hemlock place, the gentle, scraping vengeance of Silas Thorne ended. It was replaced by a furious, physical attempt to keep them prisoner, to ensure the final payment was made inside his decaying trophy, the stolen house. The sky over the Hemlock place was now a bruised, fading purple. The moment Mark and Sarah entered the house, the power went out completely, plunging the entire structure into suffocating darkness and cold. The familiar scent of damp pine became overwhelming, smelling not of fresh forest, but of a coffin lining. They knew the shade's full power was being unleashed. They didn't hesitate. They moved by the light of a single, powerful flashlight, their hearts hammering a frantic rhythm against their ribs. Mark went to retrieve the miniature axe head, while Sarah rushed to Lily's room. Lily was sitting cross-legged on her bed, perfectly still. She didn't look scared. She looked intensely focused, her small face pale in the faint light. "He's mad, Mom," Lily whispered, her eyes wide. "He knows what you're doing. He says he's not done with his work. The house is supposed to belong to him." The moment Sarah pulled Lily off the bed, a terrifying noise erupted from downstairs. Thud! The heavy front door, which had been open a crack, slammed shut with a concussive force that shook the entire house. "Mark!" Sarah screamed, rushing into the hall. Mark was already struggling with the back door. It was bolted shut from the inside, but the latch was stuck fast. He threw his weight against it, but the wood wouldn't budge. He could hear a sickening grinding noise as the locking mechanism warped and jammed, seized by an unseen, powerful force. "He's locking us in," Mark yelled, his voice echoing in the dead silence. They rushed to the windows only to find the same impossibility. The latches, some of which hadn't been secured in decades, were now impossible to move, jammed by an invisible force. The only exit was the living room window, which was old and already loose. Mark grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. Simultaneously, the woods outside exploded into furious movement. A sudden, violent gust of wind howled, even though the air indoors was completely still. Huge, thick branches began whipping and lashing against the thin window panes, a sound like terrible, desperate claws scraping for purchase. "He's right outside," Sarah cried, shielding Lily. Mark ignored the terrifying noise, focusing on the weakest point. He smashed the poker through the corner of the living room window. The glass shattered, and immediately, the room temperature plummeted, the intense, freezing cold of the felled ground rushing in, thick with the scent of pine pitch and damp earth. Mark violently wrenched the broken sash up, the wood screeching in protest. He threw his spare backpack out first. It contained a small camping shovel, a fire starter, and a sturdy metal cup for the sap. "Go! Go!" he urged, pushing Lily through the opening first, then boosting Sarah through. He followed, grabbing the cursed axe head from the windowsill where he had placed it. They were now outside, exposed, running desperately toward the boundary of the felled ground in the rapid descent of twilight. The forest itself seemed to fight them. Tangled roots sprang up to trip them, and low branches snagged their clothes. But Mark kept pushing, his mind set on the witness tree. Old Man Hemlock had said it was ancient, scarred, and near the felled ground. They burst through the final thicket, onto the edge of the barren clay. Just beyond the darkness of the felled ground, massive even in the gloom, stood a colossal maple tree, easily twice as old and thick as any other in the woods. Its bark was deeply furrowed, and a large, visible section of its trunk was covered in a century-old, dark scar where a piece of bark had been violently torn away. The witness tree. They had made it. They had escaped the collapsing house and found the essential component. The shade knew they were there. As Mark approached the base of the massive witness tree, the ground inside the felled ground seemed to darken, and the profound cold intensified. A sound began deep inside the forest, a low, guttural roar that was part wind and part human anguish. The timber shade was manifesting. Mark jammed the metal cup's edge into the scarred bark, forcing a tiny, slow stream of the tree's viscous, living sap to bleed into the container. Sarah, holding a frightened but silent Lily, fumbled with the fire starter and the dry kindling they had brought for the purification fire. As the massive, invisible presence of the shade loomed closer, Mark and Sarah were fueled by a courage born of pure desperation and parental love. They had been given the counter-ritual, and now they had executed the escape, realizing that the spiritual fight requires not just knowledge, but the unwavering courage and perseverance to see the task through, despite overwhelming, physical and supernatural odds. The spirit was strong, but their will was stronger. They had the sap and the axe, and the kindling was ready. But the roar was getting closer, and the dark space of the felled ground seemed to swell with shadow. The timber shade was here, physically blocking their attempts to honor the curse. How could they ignite a purifying fire and complete the delicate sap offering while battling the full, manifested rage of a powerful, centuries-old spirit of vengeance. The final showdown had begun. The heart of the curse was the felled ground, and the source of its power was the timber shade. Mark and Sarah had come to the spirit's domain not to fight with steel, but with ceremony, a desperate attempt to replace vengeance with respect. But when an ancient spirit is denied its payment, its final, blinding rage is the most dangerous force of all. The Millers had to complete the ritual of sap and smoke before the very land they stood on consumed them. The roar was no longer distant. It was right there, a raw, primal sound of fury and pain. The darkness on the felled ground intensified, coalescing from vague shadow into an overwhelming, terrifying vertical mass. The air grew impossibly cold, sucking the breath from their lungs. Mark, recognizing the immediate danger, pushed Sarah and Lily behind the protective bulk of the witness tree. The towering maple seemed to stand as a silent, stoic barrier against the dark clearing. Mark ran onto the barren, clay surface of the felled ground, placing the small pile of kindling and the cursed axe head on the earth. The air was so cold the kindling felt frozen. He fumbled with the flint and steel, his hands shaking, desperate to generate a spark. As he struck the flint, the timber shade solidified. It was immense, easily 12 feet tall, a horrifying tapestry of twisted branches, tangled roots, and damp, rotting pine needles. Its arms were thick, splintered logs, and its face was a gaping void, illuminated only by 2 points of intense, malevolent light. The glowing, red eyes Lily had drawn. It moved with a slow, grinding inevitability, powered by centuries of cold rage. Mine! The voice was not sound, but a vibration that Mark felt deep in his chest, rattling his bones. The wood and the life are mine. The shade was drawn inexorably toward Lily, who was whimpering quietly behind her mother. Sarah, seeing the monumental figure of vengeance advancing, scanned the ground frantically for anything to use as a defense. Her eyes landed on a large, heavy piece of thick, dark wood, an old ornamental mantelpiece they had removed during the first day of renovation, dumped unceremoniously at the edge of the woods. It was a piece of the original, stolen hemlock house timber, but it was also a piece they had rejected, a boundary of wood they had set aside. Driven by pure protective instinct, Sarah scooped up the heavy wood and held it up like a shield, placing herself between Lily and the advancing shade. "You will not touch her," Sarah screamed, the human voice thin but potent against the shade's roar. The shade paused, momentarily confounded by the sight of the woman offering up a piece of the cursed, stolen house wood as a sacrifice. It focused its glowing red eyes on Sarah, recognizing the protective love as a profound threat to its isolated vengeance. Mark finally managed to catch a spark. The kindling flared, a small, bright orange beacon against the deep purple twilight. He worked quickly, placing the miniature metal axe head onto the heart of the flames. As the flames licked the dark, cursed wood and touched the cold metal, the shade screamed again, a sound of pure agony that contained the freezing pain of 100-year-old death. It lunged, not toward Mark, but toward the fire, its massive, splintered hand sweeping the ground. Mark braced himself against the force, which felt like an invisible truck hitting him. He stumbled but did not fall. He wrestled the metal cup of witness tree sap from his pocket, the viscous, life-giving liquid trembling in the light. With a final, desperate cry, he poured the sap over the flames and the burning axe head. The result was instantaneous and profound. The fire didn't grow. It turned blindingly blue-white, roaring with a purifying energy that ripped through the cold. The cursed wood of the axe dissolved immediately, vaporized by the counter-ritual. The miniature axe head, now stripped of its binding magic, glowed for a second before sinking into the clay, harmless. The timber shade let out a final ear-splitting shriek, a long, drawn-out cry of complete loss and finality. The massive wooden body buckled, its eyes flickering violently. But as the shade began to collapse, it made one last, desperate effort. The gigantic, splintered log of its arm detached, flying through the air with terrifying speed, aiming directly at the one thing of value in the clearing Lily. Sarah didn't move. She threw herself fully over her daughter, taking the impact of the massive, splintered wood with the mantelpiece shield, which cracked with a sound like a rifle shot, knocking the air from her lungs. But Lily was untouched. The shade, its purpose thwarted by the combined power of the ritual and the mother's selfless defense, simply dissolved. The enormous, towering figure imploded, scattering into 1,000 tiny specks of shadow and pine needles that vanished instantly into the cold, still air. The ritual was done. The shade was banished, silenced by the purification fire and the sap of the witness tree. The oppressive cold on the felled ground eased slightly, replaced by a strange, clean warmth emanating from the spot where the fire had burned. Sarah, bruised and winded but fiercely protective, hugged Lily tightly. They had faced the ghost of betrayal and won, not with violence, but with reconciliation and the overwhelming primal force of selfless love. Huddled together on the cold, barren ground, watching the final wisps of purifying smoke curl toward the sky, they understood the final moral. Selfless love is the strongest force against darkness. The timber shade was born of betrayal and greed, but the family's protective, unwavering bond provided an antidote the spirit couldn't fight. They had paid the debt of the past, not with a life, but with a piece of their home and the courage of their combined soul. The shade was gone, but the felled ground was still barren, and the hemlock place was still filled with damaged, stolen wood. Had the ritual truly silenced Silas Thorne forever, or had it merely rendered the spirit dormant, awaiting the next moment of fear or discord to rise again? And how would the Millers live now, knowing they were the sworn caretakers of a land that held such potent, terrible power? The vengeance of the timber shade was silenced, driven back by the life force of the witness tree and the shield of a mother's love. But in the deep woods of Michigan, nothing is ever truly erased. The intense, active horror ends, but the haunting never quite does. It settles, it waits, and it demands constant respect. The Millers had survived the fire and the fury. Now they had to learn to live in the quiet that came after, a quiet earned at a terrible cost. The immediate silence that fell over the felled ground was not the oppressive, hungry silence they had known before. It was a profound, clean quiet, the kind of silence that follows a fierce winter storm, signaling a complete change in the atmosphere. The heavy, metallic smell of rust and cold vanished, replaced by the fresh, crisp scent of night air and pine sap. Mark helped Sarah up, noting the wide, splintered crack in the old wooden mantelpiece that had shielded Lily. It was a scar, a tangible testament to the final, desperate violence of the shade and the strength of their defense. They stood together for a long time on the edge of the barren clay, exhausted but fundamentally whole. They returned to the hemlock place, not running, but walking slowly, carrying their bruised and quiet daughter between them. The house was cold and dark, but the overwhelming sense of dread was gone. The unnatural silence was broken by the familiar, normal sounds of an old house. The tick of cooling wood, the whisper of the draft through the broken window pane. The next morning, Mark repaired the window, carefully fitting a new pane into the frame. He examined the walls where the scraping had occurred. The damage was mostly internal, hidden by the plaster, but the scent of pine pitch lingered, a subtle olfactory reminder of the ghost's tenancy. Sarah's bruises from the mantelpiece impact faded quickly, but the experience had fundamentally changed her. She no longer saw the forest as a dark, unknown enemy, but as a living, powerful entity that demanded recognition. The decision of whether to stay was never truly debated. They had faced the curse, lived its history, and performed the rite of reconciliation. To leave now would be to admit defeat and allow the land to claim its silent, vengeful victory. They decided to stay, accepting their role not just as owners, but as the caretakers of the Hemlock Place and the silent, wounded felled ground. Mark and Sarah didn't try to erase the past. Mark repaired the house's infrastructure, but he specifically chose not to plaster over the walls where the worst of the scraping had happened near Lily's room. He lightly sanded the deep indentations, sealing them with a clear varnish. They remained as long, dark, visceral scars on the interior wood, a constant, necessary reminder of the price of betrayal and the history they now carried. Lily was the first to fully heal. Her imaginary friend, Silas, was gone. She still loved wood and drawing, but her drawings were now filled with healthy, tall trees and clear sunlight. She told her parents that the man was done with his work, and he finally feels warm. The greatest change was the air. The house was no longer oppressed by the cold, heavy silence. The Millers opened the windows wide, letting in the clean, vibrant air of the Manistee National Forest. The normal, expected noises of the woods, the buzzing of insects, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of squirrels, returned, proving that the land was no longer holding its breath. A year passed. The Millers settled into their lives, living off Mark's remote work and Sarah's successful small business selling local crafts. They learned to respect the boundaries of the forest, never cutting live wood unnecessarily, and teaching Lily the old, quiet ways of the Michigan wilderness. Every autumn, on the anniversary of their confrontation, Mark, Sarah, and Lily walked together to the felled ground. The clay was still barren, cold, and quiet, but it no longer radiated malice. They brought a small, simple offering, a block of uncarved maple wood, taken from a deadfall they found in a respectful, non-cursed part of the property. They placed the block in the center of the clearing, a quiet act of recognition, a sign of respect for the betrayed spirit of Silas Thorne. As they stood on the barren earth, a gentle wind stirred the pine needles around the clearing. The saga of the timber shade taught them that the most important moral is living in harmony with history. We cannot erase the sins of the past, but we can honor their victims. By respecting the land, acknowledging the boundaries, and refusing to succumb to the fear and discord that fuel vengeance, the Millers secured their peace. The curse was a painful lesson in ecology, history, and the profound, living power of the natural world. One late evening, Mark stood on the repaired porch, watching Lily chase fireflies in the yard. He felt a deep, abiding peace, the peace of a debt paid and a curse quieted. He looked out into the dense, silent wall of the deep woods where the felled ground lay hidden. For the briefest fraction of a second, deep between the shadows of the twisted pines, he saw a tiny, flickering point of color, a faint, low flash of red light, like a dying ember catching the breeze. It vanished instantly, easily dismissed as a trick of the eye or a particularly bright firefly. Mark took a deep breath of the pine-scented air. He didn't call Sarah. He just watched the trees for a moment longer, a subtle, cold knot tightening in his chest, a quiet understanding that the timber shade was not gone. It was merely asleep, and its centuries-old slumber was conditional, dependent on the Millers' lifelong vigilance and respect. They had earned their quiet, but they would have to continue earning it every single day for the rest of their lives in the lonely woods of Michigan.